Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages. But not the glamorous kind. Not the kings or knights or even the bustling market sellers. Tonight we'll crawl a little deeper, quite literally, into a job so unpleasant, so buried beneath the surface, that most people preferred to pretend it didn't exist. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Picture yourself living in 14th century England. It's nighttime, and while others sleep soundly in their wooden homes or thatched cottages, you rise. Not because you couldn't sleep, but because your work begins in the shadows. You're a gong farmer, a person paid to clean human waste from cesspits, the medieval equivalent of sewers. Yes, that was a real job. And believe it or not, it was essential. Cities like London, York, and Norwich in the Middle Ages were growing fast, but they didn't have plumbing. Behind most homes was a small shed, what we'd call an outhouse, today connected to a cesspit. As days turned to weeks, those pits filled up. When the stench became unbearable or overflow started seeping into the streets, people called the gong farmers. Gong comes from the Old English word gang, which simply meant to go. A gong farmer was, quite literally, the person who dealt with what had gone out. You'd work at night, both because of the smell and because people didn't want to see your work. You'd dig down into cesspits, up to your knees or even wasting human waste, and scoop it out with long-handled shovels into barrels or buckets. These were then carted away from outside the city walls to be dumped or used as fertilizer. Imagine the texture, the sound, the weight. Your body aching in the cold, your arms sore from hauling, rats and insects swarming around you, yet somehow this job paid surprisingly well. In fact, it paid better than many other laborer positions of the time, because no one wanted to do it. Cities had to offer good money to those who would. But don't get too comfortable. Being a gong farmer wasn't just dirty, it was dangerous. The methane gas building up in cesspits could suffocate a person. There are records of men fainting and dying from fumes, or even from falling in and drowning. It was a profession that required strange bravery and a stomach of steel. Your clothing would be soaked, your boots sloshing with things best left undescribed. And even when you scrubbed yourself in the river afterward, the stench clung. People knew who you were. Some kept their distance. Others mocked you, even as you were doing the job that let their streets stay clean enough to walk. And while the cities shunned you by day, they needed you by night. Local governments even had ordinances about when gong farmers could work. Usually between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., some cities had dedicated dumping grounds outside the walls, sometimes called Los. In London, Southwark was a common dumping area. You'd travel across cobbled roads with your cart full of waste, the wheels creaking in the moonlight, the smell following you like a ghost. Still, even with the danger, the smell, and the stigma, this was a steady profession. In a world where work could be unpredictable and famine wasn't uncommon, knowing you had a job even won this grim stability. Some gong farmers even became minor landowners over time, buying small properties on the outskirts of town. And here's where things get more complex. The waste you collected was often sold as fertilizer. Farmers valued it, night soil, as it was called, because it enriched fields better than anything else. So, what society tossed aside as filth became a commodity. In a strange way, your job closed the loop of medieval life. You handled what everyone produced but no one wanted, and turned it into something useful again. Gong farmers also had to understand the city layout. They needed to know where cesspits were located, how to move waste discreetly, and where to take it. In larger cities, this was almost a science balancing discretion, speed, and survival. And yet, these men were often forgotten by history. No epic poems were written about them. Their names rarely appear in chronicles, unless something went wrong, death, an arrest, or a protest. Imagine spending your life doing this work and disappearing from memory as soon as you're gone. No headstone, no legacy, just the faint smell of what you left behind, and streets a little cleaner for the next day's market. So, if you found yourself suddenly transported back in time and asked to take up a job to survive, could you do this? Could you walk through streets while others turn away from your smell? Could you climb down into a cesspit night after night just for a few coins and a meal? And what does it say about society that the people who did the worst jobs, the dirtiest, the most dangerous were the ones we remember the least? So, you've just spent your first night as a gong farmer, ankle deep in other people's filth, shoveling, heaving, and navigating the darkness like an unsung guardian of public health. And while your nose might still be recovering, your work is far from over. Because here's something that might surprise you. Medieval cities weren't just dirty, they were deeply layered. Beneath the bustling streets, behind the laughter of taverns and the ringing of blacksmiths' hammers, there was an entire underworld of smells, systems, and secrets. And people like Gong farmers knew those layers better than anyone else. Let's start with the cesspits themselves. You might think these were just shallow holes. In reality, they could be surprisingly deep, sometimes over 6 feet, especially in larger towns where waste accumulated quickly. Cesspits were often lined with stone or timber and built with a kind of grim craftsmanship. The goal wasn't just to store waste, but to trap it long enough that it wouldn't bubble up through the floors or flood into streets during a rainstorm. In wealthier homes, there might be a wooden bench with a hole cut into it, placed above the pit. In poorer areas, it was often just a hole in the ground, sometimes shared by multiple households. And no, there was no flush, just gravity and time. Over time, these pits didn't just collect waste, they collected history. Archaeologists today still find broken pottery, bones, coins, buttons, hairpins, and even children's toys buried in medieval cesspits. You'd be amazed what people accidentally dropped while doing their business. Or maybe didn't drop by accident. As a gong farmer, you'd sometimes uncover more than just muck. If a ring went missing, a neighbor might whisper that it was stolen. But in reality, it could be buried at the bottom of the pit, along with weeks of waste. You might even be asked to go looking for it, carefully, but your job didn't stop. With digging, the next task, disposal, you'd haul barrels of waste through quiet alleyways, avoiding the watchful eyes of city guards and gossiping locals. If you were in London, for example, you might be heading toward the Thames, or more specifically, its muddy outer edges. Some gong farmers dumped directly into the river, though that wasn't technically allowed. The city issued fines for such behavior, but enforcement was spotty. After all, who really wanted to chase down a man covered in excrement? In some towns, the waste was moved to nearby farms, where it was spread across fields to nourish crops. This part of the job, strangely, brought you back to life green fields, open skies, the sweet smell of hay mixing uneasily with what you'd brought along. You were part of a cycle, and in a world where nothing was wasted, your work made food. Still, no matter how useful you were always other. Gong farmers lived on the outskirts of society, literally in places like York. City laws required you to live in designated areas outside the walls, far from respectable folk. In Paris, records show that workers in similar roles had to wear specific clothing so people would keep their distance, even though your work kept the city from drowning in its own waste. People didn't want to be reminded of Itoyu. This social isolation created a unique subculture among gong farmers. Some formed tight communities, helping each other with dangerous digs or teaming up for larger cesspits. You'd share stories, tools, maybe a bit of ale after the shift. No one else really understood your world. No one else had to. And while some looked down on you, others quietly respected you. City officials relied on you, especially when the weather turned warm and the smells became unbearable. In the summer months, complaints would rise. Neighbors would argue. Fines would be issued for not maintaining a pit. And suddenly, your presence was necessary again. But you didn't have much upward mobility. Gong farmers rarely escaped their role. Their children might become farmers or laborers, but more often they inherited the trade. It was a grim legacy, passed down not through pride, but necessity. You might wonder, was there ever a moment of dignity in this life? Maybe, in 1388, the English Parliament passed one of the earliest public health laws. It aimed to control where waste could be dumped and who was responsible for cleaning it. That legislation, dry and buried in archives, was a quiet nod to you, the gong farmer. You mattered, just not in the way that made it into history books. Still, in a world full of plague and war, you were part of what kept things moving, or rather, kept them from overflowing. By now, you've worked several years. You know every alley and cesspit in your district. You know which ones are shallow, which ones are dangerous, and which ones might hide something more than waste. One night, while clearing an old pit behind a crumbling tavern, your shovel hits something hard. Not a rock, something metallic. You dig further, a small chest, rusted but locked. No one's claimed it. No one knows it's there. You hesitate. This could be a forgotten treasure, or it could be garbage. But then again, how often does a gong farmer find anything worth keeping? Would you open it? Would you report it? Or bury it again beneath the waste and walk away? And if you did open it, would you like what you found? So, there you are, standing in the darkness, holding a rusted iron box just pulled from a cesspit, behind a long abandoned tavern. The smell is still thick in the air. The flies still buzz. But in your hands, you're holding a secret the city forgot. It could be nothing, or it could be everything. Now, let's not get too romantic. This isn't a story of sudden riches and freedom. More often than not, the hidden things beneath medieval cities were discarded, broken, or stolen. But it reminds us that even in the dirtiest corners of the past, history hides things we're still trying to understand. You decide to keep the box just for now. You clean it as best you can in a nearby stream. Maybe, for the first time in years, someone looks at you with curiosity rather than disgust as you carry it home. This is the quiet paradox of being a gong farmer. You live in filth, but sometimes you find what others tried to hide. By the late 1300s and into the 1400s, cities were growing faster than ever. Trade expanded, wealth increased, and more people than ever were crammed into tight, unclean quarters. Yet sanitation barely improved. Disease was rampant. In 1348, the Black Death swept through England, killing up to half the population. People fled cities, work stopped. But even then, waste still built up. And guess who was expected to clean it when everyone else was gone? That's right, you dot. It's likely that some gong farmers didn't survive the plague, but those who did became even more vital. Disease made their jobs harder, but also more respected, if only in a fearful, desperate kind of way. After all, unclean pits were now seen not just as smelly, but dangerous. People began associating bad smells, miasmas, with illness. And while they didn't fully understand germs, they were on the right track. Eventually, city councils and monarchs started investing slowly in better urban planning. In the 15th century, you start to see rudimentary waste regulations in places like London, Bristol, and York. Certain neighborhoods built public latrines over running water, which carried waste away. Not ideal, but better than a pit. And yet, even with these changes, gong farmers kept working. Privately owned cesspits still existed, especially in poorer districts. Night after night, you descended into the darkness. Generations passed. The name gong farmer slowly faded, replaced by new titles: nightmen, scavengers, or eventually sanitation workers. But your story didn't vanish entirely. Records from London, for instance, mention a man named Richard the Gong Firmer in 1370, who sued a butcher for throwing guts into his pit and making the job even harder. Another, John of Ely, was fined for dumping waste in the Thames illegally, though probably out of exhaustion. And then there are the countless nameless workers buried beneath time. The ones who kept their heads down, didn't cause trouble, and simply kept cleaning. Their work mattered, even if no one thanked them today. When we dig beneath old streets in England, especially in cities like York or London, we still find their footprints. Archaeologists unearth cesspits filled with ash, food scraps, clothing fibers, and sometimes long-lost trinkets. They carefully sort through layers of ancient waste to understand how people lived, what they ate, what they threw away. Without realizing it, the gong farmers became curators of history. Every time they cleared a pit and left behind a layer, they sealed off a piece of the past in a strange, quiet way. Youth, the one who hauled muck in the moon, light preserved a legacy, deeper than many kings or knights ever did. So now, imagine again. It's your last night on the job. You're old. Your back aches from decades of work. Your hands are cracked. Your skin weathered. You stand outside a familiar home, looking at the pit behind it. You've cleaned it 100 times, but this time, something's different. Maybe it's the silence of the city, or the distant sound of a cathedral bell. Maybe it's the memory of the first time you picked up a shovel, thinking you'd only do this until something better came along. And yet, here you are. You lower the shovel, step into the darkness one more time, not for glory, not for praise, but because someone has to. And in doing so, you're part of the quiet machinery of history, the forgotten force that held medieval cities together. We often remember the kings, the scholars, the warriors, but history wasn't built by them alone. It was built by the ones who worked in the shadows, the ones who were invisible, the ones who carried the weight of a city quite literally on their shoulders. So the next time you walk past a sewer, grate, or flush a toilet without thinking twice, remember this. Beneath your feet, centuries ago, a gong farmer once stood, and he kept the world moving, one shovelful at a time. Now, what do you think was really inside that box? ... No need to rush tonight. Take a deep breath and let your thoughts slow. We're not heading to the battlefield or trudging through a medieval city's filth. Not this time. Instead, we're stepping through a heavy wooden door into a stone-walled monastery. The air is cold, dry, and silent. There's no shouting, no business, no feasting, just the faint flicker of candlelight against the granite, and maybe the distant sound of a bell. Because tonight you're a monk, not a famous one, not an abbot or a scholar with grand theological influence, just a regular, devout brother living behind high stone walls. Your days are not defined by action, but by repetition, order, silence. You do not seek fame, and in truth, the outside world barely remembers you. But your work, it helped preserve the past. Let's begin with your morning. Although calling it morning might be misleading. You wake well before dawn around 2 or 3 a.m., when the rest of the world is fast asleep. You rise not because you want to, but because the bell rings. And in a monastery, bells are law. They tell you when to wake, when to pray, when to eat, and when to work. Think of them like the heartbeat of your entire world. You dress quickly in your woolen habit. It's simple brown or black, rough to the touch, and belted with a cord. No shoes yet, just cold stone floors and bare feet as you shuffle silently to the chapel for matins, the first prayer of the day. This isn't a quick prayer, it's a full service, often lasting an hour or more. You stand, you chant, you kneel. The words are in Latin, memorized through endless repetition. It's dark outside, and even darker inside. A few candles light the choir stalls. No conversation, of course. You've taken a vow of silence, or if not complete silence, then strict regulation of speech. After matins, you return to your cellar. Small stone room, often no bigger than a closet. Maybe you rest, maybe you read, if your monastery has enough books. Most likely, you prepare mentally for Lauds, the next prayer, just before dawn. It's a rhythm that repeats, over and over again. After Lauds, you perform chores, cleaning, sweeping, feeding animals. Then prime, another round of prayer. Then breakfast if you can call it that. Let's talk food for a moment. Medieval monks didn't eat lavishly. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by most Western monastic communities, emphasized simplicity and restraint. No meat from four-legged animals. Meals were often bread, pottage, beans, or porridge. Sometimes cheese or dried fish. On feast days, maybe a small indulgence, a bit of honey or spiced wine. But even then, it's eaten in silence. While one monk reads aloud from scripture or the writings of the early church fathers, you eat quickly, no conversation, just the scrape of wooden spoons and the slow cadence of holy words echoing through the whole dot. And then it's time for work. Now, here's where your day might differ from the others. Because not all monks were scribes. Some tended gardens, some brewed ale or managed livestock, others mended clothes or built walls. But tonight, let's assume you work in the scriptorium, the cold, drafty writing room where manuscripts are, copied by hand. This is a slow, painstaking task. You sit at a slanted desk, a single candle at your side, and carefully copy line after line of Latin text onto parchment, not paper parchment. That means animal skin, scraped and treated until smooth enough for ink. The ink itself is handmade too, from oak galls, iron salts, and gum. You dip your quill, scratch the words, and repeat. If you make a mistake, you don't crumple the page and toss it. You carefully scrape off the ink with a knife and write again. Or worse, start the whole page over. The work is slow, dull, repetitive, but it's meaningful, because remember, this is before the printing press. Every book you copy is a unique creation. Without you, these words might vanish forever. Scripture, philosophy, histories, herbal guides, all preserved because of your cold fingers and sore back. Every few hours, another bell rings, calling you to the next prayer. Terce, sext, nun. These divide the workday. You stop what you're doing, wash your hands, and head back to the chapel. Then comes the midday meal. Again, silence. Again, simplicity. Afterward, some rest is permitted. A nap, perhaps. Then more work, then more prayer, then vespers, the evening service, and finally, compline, the last prayer of the day. When you return to your cell at night, there's no fire. Maybe a woolen blanket, maybe straw on the floor. You lie down, still in your habit, and fall asleep as quietly as you rose. Then, only a few hours later, the bell rings again. It might sound like a repetitive life, because it is. That was the point. Life in the Middle Ages was built around the idea of stability and discipline. Your time wasn't your own. It belonged to God. Every hour was accounted for, every word measured. You were one part of a silent ancient machine designed to focus your soul and preserve the sacred. But what happens when the outside world begins to change? In the next section, we'll look at how monasteries functioned not just as places of prayer but as medieval hubs of power, land, and learning. And we'll ask a quiet question. Did monks like you shape the world more than we realize? Weren't just places of worship. In the medieval world, they were small, highly organized ecosystems, in many cases. They were among the wealthiest and most influential institutions of the time. From the outside, a monastery might look like a collection of stone buildings behind high walls, usually built away from cities, tucked into hillsides or woodlands. But within those walls, a well-oiled machine was humming away. Let's take a sleepy walk around it. There's the chapel, of course, at the center of monastic life. Then the cloister, a square courtyard with a covered walkway where monks stroll in silent reflection. Along the sides are the chapter house for meetings, the dormitory, the kitchen, the dining hall or refectory, and the all-important scriptorium. But then you have the unexpected: stables, barns, granaries, gardens, fish ponds, even workshops, because monks didn't just pray, they worked. And they worked a lot. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and widely followed by medieval monks, declared, "Idleness is the enemy of the soul." So monks balanced prayer with manual labor. They farmed, they raised sheep. For wool, they brewed beer, yes. Monastic beer was real, and it kept communities hydrated when water was questionable. They made cheese, they copied manuscripts, they pressed olives if they lived further south. Every part of life was regimented, useful and ideally self-sufficient. But not everything was made with their own hands. Monasteries, you see, owned land. A lot of it, sometimes thousands of acres, passed down by wealthy nobles, hoping to secure a shortcut to heaven. And with land came power. Monks became landlords, often reluctantly, sometimes enthusiastically. They collected rents, managed peasants, and supervised estates. Lay brothers or hired laborers did much of the field work, while monks oversaw records and finances. In some cases, abbots, the heads of monasteries, were as powerful as barons. They sat in royal councils. They owned mills and fisheries. Their lands had serfs, just like any feudal lord. This raises a curious paradox. These men had taken vows of poverty, yet many lived in communities surrounded by wealth, not personal luxury, of course. Most monks still lived with basic clothing, bland food, and no private property. But collectively, their monasteries might be wealthy beyond imagination. Some churches were adorned with gold-leafed icons, relics, and stained glass. Some scriptoria produced illuminated manuscripts, so intricate they seemed more divine than human. The Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, stunning masterpieces, made by hands trained in patient repetition, and yet, for all this grandeur, life remained boring in the most sacred sense of the word. Everything a monk did was designed to be unchanging, predictable, safe. It was a world wrapped in tradition, where the past was copied literally onto parchment and preserved for the future. Let's stop and consider something odd. If you were a peasant in 11th century England or 13th century France, the monastery was probably the quietest and cleanest place you'd ever see. Monks bathed more regularly than most medieval folk, not daily, but more than the average farmer. They cleaned their clothes, kept orderly spaces, and practiced basic hygiene, often using herbal knowledge passed down in monastic texts. They were also the neighborhood doctors. Not all monks were trained physicians, but many studied medical writings from Greece and Rome preserved, again, in those endlessly copied manuscripts. They tended to the sick using herbs from their gardens. Some monasteries had infirmaries, small hospital-like wings where ill monks or occasionally outsiders could rest. Their methods weren't always effective bloodletting anyone, but their intentions were sincere, and their knowledge mattered. In an age where education was rare, the monastery was a beacon. It was one of the only places where reading, writing, and scholarship were practiced daily, not for fame, not for profit, but for the slow and faithful work of preserving ideas. Now, here's something else that might surprise you. Despite all this order, not all monks stayed monks forever. Some left the cloister, disillusioned or restless. Others were forced to leave, due to illness, scandal, or failure to uphold vows. And not all monasteries were holy havens. Some were corrupt, lazy, or entangled in politics. Reforms came in waves: Cluniac, Cistercian, Franciscanal, trying to pull monasticism back to its roots, away from luxury and back to silence and humility. But for every corrupt monk, there were dozens more quiet, nameless, unrecorded, woke at 3 a.m., trudged across cold stone floors, and whispered ancient prayers to the dark sky. Just like the monk you've been walking beside tonight, he's never known life outside the monastery. He doesn't think of history or legacy. He thinks of the Psalms. He thinks of tomorrow's fast. He thinks of his aching fingers and the blank parchment waiting for him at dawn. Yet, because of men like him, entire centuries of knowledge survived. War, famine, and fire. When kings fell, and cities burned, and towers crumbled, these quiet men in wool robes kept writing, kept preserving, kept praying. In our final section, we'll ask what happens when this peaceful rhythm finally breaks. Because no age lasts forever, not even the age of monks. For centuries, monasteries had been the beating hearts of rural, medieval life, quiet, stable, slow-moving centers of faith, knowledge, and labor. But history, as it always does, shifted in the late Middle Ages. That steady silence began to unravel. It didn't happen all at once, of course. Life in a monastery was resistant to change by design. But outside those high stone walls, the world was changing rapidly, and eventually, it came knocking. Let's begin with one of the most devastating visitors, the plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, monasteries were not spared. In fact, they were particularly vulnerable. Monks cared for the sick, offered shelter, and prayed with the dying. And so, they died in high numbers themselves. Some entire monasteries were wiped out. Others were left with only a handful of surviving brothers. Skilled scribes, herbalists, and librarians vanished overnight. Libraries went unguarded. Prayers fell silent. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about knowledge. Many monks had specific tasks: scopiers, gardeners, stewards, and, if one of them died, the chain of memory broke. The garden layout was forgotten. The medicinal recipe wasn't passed on. The half-finished manuscript was never completed. But even the plague wasn't the only force pulling monastic life apart. By the 15th and 16th centuries, a new power was rising: humanism. The Renaissance brought with it a spirit of individual inquiry and a hunger for classical learning. More people learned to read. Universities began to outshine monasteries in scholarship. The printing press, Gutenberg's remarkable invention, meant books could be produced quickly and cheaply. No more years spent hunched over parchment in candlelight. The scriptorium, once the proud soul of the monastery, became obsolete almost overnight. Imagine the scene. A monk who has spent his entire life copying letters by hand watches a printed book for the first time. Neat, identical lines. No smudges, no human error. Faster, cheaper, efficient. It must have felt like witnessing the end of the world. And then came the biggest shock of all, the Reformation, beginning in the early 1500s. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther and others, sent shockwaves through the religious world. One of its sharpest criticisms: the wealth and power of the Catholic Church, including monasteries. To reformers, many monasteries had grown lazy, corrupt, or out of touch. Their lands, they argued, could be put to better use. Their rituals, stripped of meaning. Their silence, no longer sacred but suspicious. In England especially, under King Henry VIII, this meant destruction. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry ordered the dissolution of the monasteries, an unprecedented campaign to seize monastic wealth and dissolve their communities. Monks were evicted. Abbeys were stripped of their valuables. Ancient libraries were broken apart. Gold was melted. Tombs were looted. Some monks were given pensions. Others became beggars. A few resisted and were executed. Over 800 monasteries, abbeys, and convents were shut down. Imagine a monk waking up one morning, walking into the refectory for breakfast, only to be told that this sacred life, his home, his brothers, his calling, was no more. His monastery had been sold. His chapel would become a barn. The silence was broken forever. Some ruins still remain today, scattered across the English countryside, crumbling cloisters and weathered arches, half swallowed by grass. If you walk through them in the early morning, you might still hear the wind whispering psalms between the stones. But monasticism didn't die everywhere. In other parts of Europe, monasteries survived. Some reformed themselves, others resisted and endured. Even today, monks and nuns continue to live quiet lives in secluded communities, but their role in society has changed. They are no longer power brokers or landowners. Their silence is no longer the backbone of civilization. And that brings us to the final question. What did it all mean? What was the purpose of these silent lives, spent in repetition and ritual? Some historians say monasteries were the last strongholds of ancient knowledge. Others see them as early engines of organized labor and education. And some simply see them as quiet sanctuaries, imperfect, yes, but filled with earnest attempts, at peace in a violent age. For us, they offer a strange comfort, a reminder that even in history's noisiest times, someone was sitting quietly copying a sentence, tending a herb garden, whispering a prayer at 3 a.m. Someone was preserving the past so we could remember it. And now, as your eyes grow heavier, and the candle burns low, you may wonder, if you had been born in the 12th century, would you have lasted a day as a monk? No meat, no laughter, no speaking, no comfort, only silence, parchment, ... and porridge. Then again, perhaps in the chaos of medieval life, that silence was the most precious gift of all. ... The day began long before the sun even considered rising. If you were a peasant woman in a medieval village, let's call her Elswith, you didn't wake to an alarm clock or the gentle chime of a phone. You rose when the rooster gave his first grating call, or when your baby started fussing beside you on the straw-stuffed mattress. Your bed, if you could call it that, was not much more than a few coarse linens and maybe a woolen blanket laid over a pile of dried straw in a wooden frame. And yes, there were bedbugs, plenty of them, fleas too. Not out of neglect, but because cleanliness in the way we understand it simply wasn't a concept yet. Soap existed, yes, but bathing was infrequent and water access was limited, especially in colder seasons. So, Elswith rolls over, rubs her eyes, and starts another day. The small one-room cottage she shares with her husband and 3 children is already alive with subtle movement, the creak of timber, the rustle of old cloth, the low snore of her husband, still clinging to a few more minutes of sleep. There's no privacy. Everyone sleeps together in the same space, often even alongside a goat or a chicken or two, especially in winter when bringing animals inside helped keep the air slightly warmer. Elswith pulls on her woolen, kirtled her main piece of clothing and fastens a belt made of simple twine. Underneath, a linen shift she probably hasn't washed in a few weeks. It's not a matter of laziness. There's simply too much to do, and the stream where she launders clothes is a half-mile away, and ice cold most months. Hygiene was seasonal. She covers her hair with a linen coif, tying it snugly. It's not just modesty, it's practical. Lice are a daily nuisance, and keeping her hair wrapped limits the spread, though never fully preventing it. There's no shampoo, no conditioner, no fragrant bars of soap, just lye-based scrub, harsh and biting to skin, with a practiced rhythm. She stirs the coals in the hearth, coaxing yesterday's embers back to life. Fire is everything. It heats, it cooks, it protects. If it goes out, it's not a simple matter of flicking a lighter. She'd have to beg a coal from a neighbor or attempt to relight it with flint and steel, which takes time and energy she doesn't have. Fire must be preserved, like life itself. She sets on to prepare the morning meal. It isn't glamorous. A bit of dark bread heart, maybe starting to mold at the edges. She scrapes off the worst and toasts the rest on a flat stone, for drink ale. Yes, even in the morning, water is rarely trusted, often carries illness. Low alcohol ale is safer. Everyone drinks it, including the children. It's a thin, grainy brew, not strong or pleasant, but nourishing and safer than the stream. The children rouse slowly. The eldest boy, maybe 10, helps carry a pail of water from the communal well. The youngest girl cries from hunger. Elswith offers her a chunk of bread soaked in ale, chewing a bit of it herself to soften it. There's no sugar, no jam, no butter, just bread. Occasionally she might have onion or a bit of lard saved from a pig slaughtered weeks ago, but that's for later. Breakfast must be light. They have to conserve. Once the sun breaks the horizon, her real work begins. You might imagine field work as a male task, but in truth, peasant women labored as much as men. While her husband tends to heavier ploughing or repairs, Ellsworth heads too. The garden behind the house, rows of cabbages, leeks, maybe some beans, weeding, watering, checking for pests. Everything they eat depends on this garden, and so does winter survival. A bad harvest isn't just inconvenient, it's deadly. Her hands are rough, dirt cakes beneath her fingernails. Her palms are calloused, her back always aching. But there's no time for rest. She returns to the cottage to spin wool hand spinning. With a drop spindle, turning fleece from their one sheep into usable thread. It's slow, hypnotic work, useful for storytelling. Sometimes, while spinning, she tells her youngest child stories, mostly religious, a few bits of folklore. She doesn't know how to read, but she knows the rhythms of prayer and the names of saints. By midday, hunger returns. She prepares pottage, essentially a stew that never ends. Always simmering, always added to. Today it's peas, bits of dried onion, perhaps a scrap of salted pork if they're lucky. She ladles it into wooden bowls, and everyone eats with shared spoons or fingers. No napkins, no forks. The smell of smoke clings to everything, even during meals. Ellsworth is thinking about what comes next, mending her son's tunic, feeding the animals, gathering firewood. Her day has no breaks, only transitions. Let's not forget, there's always the church. Religion governs the rhythm of Ellsworth's world. The church bell rings for mass, for prayer, for holy days. She cannot read the Latin scriptures, but she knows the stories. Sunday is the only day of some rest, but even that involves early mass, and hours on her feet. Her faith is deep, if simple. Heaven is her hope, hell is her fear, and saints are everyday companions. She keeps a tiny wooden cross hung by the hearth. Sometimes she prays there while stirring pottage, hoping her youngest survives the winter. A fever has been going round, coughing, shaking. No one knows what causes it. They only know who doesn't wake up. In the afternoon, she heads to the fields again, this time to gather leftover grain after the men's harvest. It's tiring, often stooped over for hours, but every handful matters. It might become bread or porridge, or it might be traded for eggs. By the time the sun lowers, she's bone-tired, her back throbs, her feet ache. But dinner must be made. Animals must be checked. The baby must be soothed. There are no early nights, even when your body begs for one. After dark, she patches a hole in her husband's shoe by candlelight. Tallow candles, smoky and pungent. Her fingers bleed slightly from the needle, but she keeps going, and when it's time to sleep, it's not peaceful. The children squirm. In their sleep, the baby cries again, the dog scratches at fleas, and the wind whistles through the cracks in the walls. She lies down, staring into the thatch roof, wondering, will tomorrow be better? Will it rain too much, too little? Will her child's fever break? And what if it doesn't? The rhythm of Ellsworth's life, like most medieval peasant women, followed the seasons. Everything, her work, her meals, her hopes, her fears, was tied to what the earth gave or withheld. Now picture her in the height of summer. The sun is longer in the sky, but that doesn't mean leisure. quite the opposite. Longer days meant longer hours in the field, more time to gather, tend, preserve. Ellsworth's back remained bent for much of the day, either weeding the garden, stacking bundles of herbs, or helping in the barley fields. Her fingers quickly braiding together sheaves, while her neck burned under the coarse cloth meant to shield her from the sun. There's no such thing as sunscreen or insect repellent. If her skin peeled or her face blistered, it was just part of life. If flies or gnats swarmed her eyes and lips, she worked through it. If she scratched too much and got an infection, she prayed to Saint Apollonia or Saint Cuthbert and applied a poultice of garlic or crushed nettles, because that's what she knew. She knew which herbs to use for cuts and which to chew for stomach pain. She'd inherited that knowledge from her mother, who got it from hers. No textbooks, just memory, experience, and whispered advice passed from one tired woman to another during the short rests between chores. Winter, however, was a different world. In winter, the cold pressed into every crack of their home. Ellsworth's hands were red and cracked from the cold. Firewood had to be rationed. Blankets were few. The baby stayed closest to the fire. Cooking was done in layers of shawls and mitts made from patched scraps. Meals were more meager, fresh. Greens, only preserved cabbage, dried beans, and whatever root vegetables had survived in the cellar without molding. Meat, if any, was salt-cured and carefully measured. Still, she worked. In winter, women spun wool and mended every garment they could save. They cleaned out storage pits, checked the barrels of ale and salted pork, and tended to the hens and goats kept inside. The home smelled like smoke, sour milk, wet straw, and animal waste, but it was warm. Sort of. Even in this quiet season, illness was constant. Colds could easily become deadly infections. An infected tooth might swell until it abscessed. Childbirth, already dangerous, became even more so in the cold, damp winter months. Ellsworth had known women who had died in childbed, maybe even her own sister or neighbor. There were no midwives in every village, no clean linens, no pain relief, just strong hands, boiled water if available, and fervent prayer. She herself had labored 3 times, each birth a small miracle that she'd survived. She still feared the next one. And yet, joy existed, too, just not the kind you'd expect. There were festivals, feast days, midsummer dances, though modest. Ellsworth once wore a crown of daisies and laughed so hard her ribs ached, spinning in a circle while someone played a reed flute. There were saints' days, marked with extra bread, borrowed honey, and, if luck permitted, roasted fish or bird. There were small gifts to her daughter collecting a bird's egg in the spring, her husband carving a little spoon out of wood, her neighbor lending her to apples from a nearly empty basket. No one had much. That was the point. But they shared what they could. There was also the church. While life was harsh, faith offered structure, a promise, even if not always comfort. The idea that suffering on earth might lead to peace in heaven made the unbearable somehow bearable. Ellsworth didn't understand Latin, but she understood the glow of candlelight in a dark stone chapel. She understood the rhythm of psalms, the kindness of the local priest, the hope that Mary watched over her. Her beliefs were woven into her bones. They were not abstract, they were part of her every action. Of course, there were duties beyond survival, social expectations. As a woman, Ellsworth was expected to obey her husband, to serve, to bear children, to manage the home. There was no sense of career or self-fulfillment. Her worth was measured in how clean her children were, how full the pottage pot was, How few times the neighbors could say she shirked her duties, and yes, sometimes she did feel anger unspoken, quiet frustration. Why did he get to rest? More often, why was she the one up with the baby at night? The one scrubbing, cooking, tending, but it was never voiced. That's just how life was. There was no word for burnout. No time to feel it, even if there was. Every now and then, a noble would ride past the village, cloaks embroidered with golden thread, horses sleek and tall. Elswith would stop her work and watch, just for a moment, not with envy exactly, but a kind of distant awe like watching a storm roll in from the hills. That world felt alien to her, unreachable. She didn't want their clothes or palaces. She wanted enough barley for bread through spring, for her daughter to survive her next fever, for the garden not to flood. And then, just as quickly, she'd return to mending, or hauling, or spinning. Nobles could gallop by. The barley still needed grinding. It's easy, from a modern distance, to imagine her life as entirely bleak. And yes, by our standards, it was unimaginably hard. But Elswith didn't have our comparisons. She didn't long for a hot shower or a day off with a book. She longed for early springs and mild winters, for peaceful pregnancies and quiet nights. She longed for her children to reach adulthood, for a better harvest next year. She longed, but she endured. Her daily life might seem small in the annals of history, but hers was the type of life that made up the overwhelming majority of medieval Europe. The peasants, especially the women, kept the world turning quietly while kings warred, popes plotted, and cities burned. So what happens when someone like Elswith breaks routine? What if a bad harvest turns into a famine? What if her husband falls sick and cannot plough the fields? What if war brushes up against her village? What then? It always started the same way. A mist rainfall, a brown patch spreading through the barley, a sudden late frost nipping at the young shoots in the garden. Elswith noticed it before most, because she was the one pulling weeds, the one turning soil with bare hands, the one waking up each morning with her eyes on the ground. She knew what a sick crop looked like, and she knew what it meant. The harvest came up short, not disastrously at first, just enough to stretch the stores too thin. Fewer sacks of barley to grind, fewer onions drying in the rafters, fewer turnips to salt and store. Enough for now, but not enough for the long cold months to come. And so, like most peasant women across Europe, Elswith tightened the belt on her household. She cut her own portions. She watered the pottage more. She dried nettles and wild herbs to bulk up meals. Every crust was saved, every bowl scraped clean. But the hunger crept in anyway. Children whined more at night. Her husband's cough grew louder. Neighbors began to quietly trade prized belongings, wooden toys, old cloaks, even tools for food. And then came the real blow. The next spring's seed grain was gone. They had eaten it to survive the winter. That's when the village felt it. The tipping point. The balance between scraping by and falling into famine had been lost. Elswith watched as entire families abandoned their homes, hoping to find work or food in nearby towns, only to be turned away or taxed to death. People began boiling grass, eating bark. There were rumors of worse, of what people did when even grass was gone. She didn't speak those rumors aloud, and then came the sickness. Famine made bodies fragile, and disease was always lurking. Something passed through the village that sprang feverish fast. Elswith lost her youngest, the baby she'd nursed through so many nights by the fire. She wrapped her in her best linen and buried her in the small graveyard behind the chapel. The priest murmured blessings. Ellsworth's voice cracked during the final amen. But she kept going, because she had no choice. Even in times of despair, there were tasks. Chickens to check, a daughter still living, water to haul, food to scavenge. She boiled weeds. She picked nettles with gloves. She helped a neighbor birth a child that would never cry. She mended every torn hem, patched every leaking roof tile, dried every tear with a steady hand. Fire broke out one sad accident from a tipped oil lamp. Half the village went up in smoke. Ellsworth helped beat the flames with wet blankets, her lungs choked with soot. Their own cottage partially burned, but they survived. Rebuilt, shared a roof with another family for weeks. Bodies packed tight, privacy gone. And still she worked, still she prayed. The church became more than a place of worship, became a refuge. A place to weep quietly without being asked to explain. A place to light a candle for the dead and beg the Virgin for mercy. Ellsworth went often, not because her faith was unshakable, but because she needed something, anything to believe in. The years crawled. Some were better, others worse. Her eldest son survived a fever, only to be conscripted into the Lord's levy and never seen again. Her husband injured his leg in a cart accident and limped for the rest of his life. Her daughter married young, as she had, and moved to another village. Ellsworth wept the day she left, not because she doubted the match, but because it left her alone. Alone, but not idle. Even in her later years, she worked. She tended gardens, dried herbs, delivered babies, taught younger women how to spin, how to cook without wasting, how to survive a lean winter without losing hope. She passed on knowledge no book could hold: how to tell when barley was ripe by its sound in the wind, how to treat a burn with fat in time, how to pray when there were no words left. You might wonder, did she ever feel joy? She did. It came quietly when she tasted the first apple of the season, when the hearth fire caught on a single spark, when her granddaughter reached for her hand and laughed. It was a small joy, a quiet one, but it was enough. And in her final years, Ellsworth became something of a village, elder respected, sought after. Not because she was rich, or educated, or powerful, but because she endured. Because she remembered the times others had forgotten. Because she had held so much grief, and still smiled. And then, one spring, she passed. No bells rang. No chronicler wrote her name. No grave marker with fancy words. Just a cross of wood, a circle of stones, and the knowledge that she had mattered deeply to those who remained. History rarely records the names of women like Ellsworth, but it should, because it was their hands that planted the fields, that stirred the pots, that caught the babies, that buried the dead. It was their endurance, their grit, their quiet faith, that held society together through fire, famine, and death. And while the kings made wars and the lords built castles, it was Ellsworth bent over a garden row, soothing a child, boiling nettles who kept the world breathing. Now close your eyes and imagine her one last time, sitting beside a fire, spinning wool, a baby asleep in her lap. The fire crackles, the wind hums outside, and Ellsworth is still, because for once her work is done. You might think of a bridge as just a way to get from one place to another, but in medieval London, a bridge was far more than that, especially one as grand and as crowded as London Bridge. Beneath its stone arches and above its roaring tide, lived people whose stories you've likely never heard. And tonight, we step quietly into the life of one such figure, the bridge keeper. He wasn't a lord. He wasn't a knight. He wasn't even a merchant. But without him, the rhythm of London Bridge would fall into chaos. His name is lost to time, like most who live beneath the reach of history's spotlight. But his tasks, his burdens, and his quiet importance endure in the mortar between those ancient stones. London Bridge wasn't just a bridge, it was a city in itself, with houses, shops, chapels, and workshops perched along its 19 piers. It buzzed day and night with the clatter of carts, the shouting of traders, and the uneven footsteps of pilgrims on their way to Stark. And deep below, between the rising, damp and echoing drips of the river, lived a man whose job was as thankless as it was vital, maintaining order, cleaning refuse, tending to candles in the alcoves, and watching for anyone foolish enough to cause trouble on the span. He awoke long before the city did. The first light hadn't broken yet over the Thames. The bridge was cloaked in mist, the kind that settled into your bones and refused to leave. The bridge keeper's home was no larger than a stable stall, a rough room built against the inner wall of the bridge, where the stones sweated and rats often wandered freely. His first task was to walk the length of the bridge, checking for damage. Wooden beams groaned under the weight of stone houses, some leaning ever so slightly farther out each month. Icicles sometimes formed in winter, falling dangerously on those below. Candles left burning in shrines along the bridge sometimes toppled, and once a fishmonger had been found frozen on his cart before dawn. It was the bridge keeper who found him, and the bridge keeper who cleaned up the mess. He carried a long staff not for protection, but for knocking on doors and moving debris. If someone was sleeping rough, curled in an alcove, or behind a barrel, it was his job to nudge them awake and send them on their way. If someone had spilled blood, even from a scuffle, it was his job to clean it before the city stirred. But his work wasn't just physical, it was political in its own quiet way. London Bridge was shared turf. Half belonged to the City of London, the other half to the Bishop of Winchester. Jurisdiction was tricky. If a brawl broke out in the middle of the bridge, who had the right to arrest? The answer was, whoever got there first. But it was the bridge keeper who usually got there before anyone else did. He wasn't without enemies. Some saw him as a nuisance, especially the children who lived in the cramped apartments above. He was the one who stopped their games when the noise got too loud. The one who chased them down when they stole bits of fish or sweetmeats from traders. Others simply ignored him, which may have stung more. He was invisible in plain sight. As people passed by arguing over the price of wool, or whispering secrets under their hoods, he swept, scrubbed, and watched. Food was simple and forgettable. He took his bread stale, his cheese hard, and his ale weak. Sometimes he shared a pot of onion pottage with a cooper who lived nearby. Sometimes he sat alone, legs dangling above the water, tossing crumbs to the gulls and watching barges slide silently under the arches. Time didn't pass for him as it did for others. There were no bells to mark his meals, no servants to call him, just the bridge, always the bridge. Sometimes, when it rained in London, that meant often the water would rise. The arches would echo louder, like voices calling up from deep stoned throats. He watched the water carefully. A sudden rush could tear apart small boats. He once saw a boy swept away, his cries drowned by the roaring tide. He never forgot the sound. At night, the bridge took on another life. Lanterns swayed from iron hooks, casting flickering light across worn cobbles. Shadows danced in the windows of the shops above. Thieves tiptoed, lovers whispered, and priests sometimes crossed on their way to the other side of the city, cloaked in silence, but someone had to stay awake. That someone was him. He carried a small hourglass, one he turned each hour to keep track of the long night. He kept it near the tiny oil lamp in his room, and the sand was soft and fine, brought from the south coast perhaps, or even from Normandy. The bridge keeper wasn't a man of luxury, but that hourglass was his one prized possession. A gift, long ago, from someone he no longer spoke of. Every hour he turned the glass. Every hour he walked the bridge. And every hour he reminded himself this was his world. Not grand, not honored, but essential. The bridge stood because people like him kept walking it, and yet no one truly knew him. There are no plaques with his name, no statues, no records, save perhaps a brief mention in some neglected city ledger. He was one of many, and when he died, likely of cold or infection or something that went unnamed, someone else took up the job. The bridge didn't pause. It never did. But if you close your eyes and listen to the soft lapping of the Thames, you might still hear the echo of his steps, measured, patient, forgotten. And so you have to wonder, how many stories like his are buried in the mortar of cities? How many lives passed in service to something greater, never asking for thanks and never receiving them? By daylight, the bridge was chaos. It wasn't like the calm you might imagine. Slow crossing, maybe a few people walking to market, a breeze fluttering a merchant's hood. No, London Bridge, in the heart of the Middle Ages, was a packed artery of life, commerce, noise, and smells. At any given hour, carts jammed with firewood clattered over the worn stones, fishwives shouted over eels and salted herring, and the scent of rotting turnips mingled with coal smoke and unwashed bodies. The bridge keeper was part of this mess, but not of it. He moved through the flow like a shadow, always watching, always fixing what needed fixing, never being thanked. When a wheel broke or a horse collapsed, it was him who fetched help. When a crowd formed too thick to let anyone pass, it was his voice that barked, "Move along." Not harsh, not cruel, just necessary. And his duties never really stopped. The chapel on the bridge, St. Thomas's Chapel, was one of the few places of peace. Built into the bridge itself, it served both travelers and residents, offering a place to kneel and light a candle. The bridge keeper would visit daily, not to pray, but to make sure the candles hadn't fallen, the floors hadn't gone too damp, or a pigeon hadn't nested in the rafters again. One time, he'd found a cat, curled up under the altar, gnawing on a rat. He simply swept it out and carried on. There were rents to track too. The buildings on the bridge weren't just homes, they were valuable property, managed and taxed by the city. Shopkeepers paid to set up their rent. The keeper had a ledger tucked away in a cracked wooden chest where he recorded who owed what. He wasn't the taxman, not exactly, but he kept things tidy enough that the real taxman didn't have to come down too often. He preferred it that way. Still, not all business was official. At night, when the shops closed and the bridge grew still, a different economy stirred. There were rumors of secret dealings, Mughlers moving goods, a priver, letters passed in the dark, even whispers of plots against the crown. He never asked questions. He wasn't a spy, wasn't a judge, but once in a while he'd find a coin, left on his sill with no note, and he knew it meant someone wanted him to look the other way. And so he did, but not always. He wasn't corrupt, not in the way you might think. He simply understood that life on the bridge had its own laws, its own pulse, and if you tried to fight that, you'd lose. Better to steer it gently than try to stop the tide. There were floods, of course, The Thames wasn't a river to be trusted. Some days it was low and gentle. Other days, especially after a storm or a spring thaw upstream, the water rose quickly and without mercy. The arches under London Bridge narrowed the current, forcing the tide through like a funnel. Boats had to be steered carefully or smashed against the piers. The keeper knew this well. He'd seen it happen. One winter, the river froze, thick enough that children walked out on it and danced. But when it thawed, the ice broke loose in great chunks, slamming into the stone supports with terrifying force. He'd been out there in the dark, lantern held high, watching and waiting to see if the bridge would hold. It did, barely, still. There were repairs to manage after. Chunks of mortar loosened, beams soaked and warped. He helped the masons where he could, dragging buckets, lighting fires to keep tools warm. His hands were cracked and cold for weeks. No one remembered that part. He also tended to the sick in his own way. There was no hospital on the bridge, but there were always people in need. An old woman with a bad hip who couldn't climb stairs. A child with a cough that rattled like a cartwheel. He brought them bread when he had it, herbs from a tanner's wife who knew a bit about healing. He never expected thanks and rarely got it, but he did it anyway, and he buried the dead, quietly, discreetly. Sometimes a beggar froze in the night, or a drunk tumbled off the edge, and it was the bridge keeper who found them. He'd fetch a priest if he could. If not, he'd say the prayers himself. He wasn't ordained, but the words still held weight. He believed they should be remembered, even if just by him. He had his routines. Every evening, just before dusk, he'd sit by the water for a few minutes. His legs would dangle over the edge, his boots worn smooth from years of walking the bridge. He'd watch the river churn beneath him, and in those moments, the city's noise faded. He could almost pretend the world wasn't so heavy. The younger ones mocked him, sometimes called him the ghost of the bridge. But deep down, they knew the truth. If the bridge keeper vanished, things would fall apart. Slowly, perhaps, but certainly. He had no family left, or none that he spoke of. Some said he'd once had a son, lost to fever. Others thought he was a former soldier, too broken by war to return to battle. He never confirmed or denied either tale. He just kept walking the bridge day after day, night after night, and every so often, when the mist rolled in thick and the lanterns flickered low, he wondered how many more steps would he take before he was the one forgotten beneath the stones. The last winter came early. The frost crept in before the leaves had finished falling. Merchants complained of numb fingers as they counted coin, and horses slipped more often on the iced stones. The bridge keeper felt it in his knees an ache that pulsed with every step. It had been decades, maybe more than 4, since he first walked the length of London Bridge with purpose. And now, even the wood beneath his feet seemed to groan with him. He didn't say it aloud, but he knew this season would be different. There was a strange stillness in the mornings, the kind that made the pigeons quiet and the river move slower than it should. The fog, which he once welcomed as a kind of companion, now felt heavier, thicker, as if it held back something just out of view. Still, his routine continued. He checked the lanterns, scraped frost from the chapel's latch, cleared icicles that formed dangerously above the walkway. One had fallen the previous week, narrowly missing a cloth seller's head. The merchant offered no thanks when warned, only muttered something about cursed cold and higher taxes. But the keeper didn't do it for gratitude. One night he found a boy curled in a corner, thin and shaking under a worn cloak. The child said, Nothing, just stared with wide eyes. The keeper sat beside him, pulled a bit of salted bread from his coat and handed it over. They didn't speak. But when he passed by the next evening, the boy was gone and the bread was gone too. That was enough. More and more, he thought about the river, not as a barrier or a threat, but as something ancient, patient. The Thames had carried kings and criminals alike. It had swallowed ships, delivered plagues, and fed the city. It had heard the footsteps of thousands cross its bridge, and it would outlast them all. Sometimes, in the late hours, when even the drunkards had wandered off, he would stand at the midpoint and look down not at the water, but at the blackness beneath it, the nothingness. It wasn't a fear he felt. Exactly, more like a calling, not a violent one. A whisper, soft as silt. There had been talk of changes. The city council murmured about repairs again, maybe even new construction further upriver. Some questioned the need for a full-time bridgekeeper, now that younger labourers could be paid half wages. The keeper heard this talk, pretended not to care, but he did, because the bridge was more than stone and wood to him. It was memory. Every crack in the parapet, every carved name on the support beams, every patch where mortar had crumbled away, he knew them. Not like a builder knows blueprints, but like a farmer knows the feel of soil between his fingers. The bridge was alive, and he had been its heartbeat. But hearts don't beat forever. One cold morning, he didn't rise. A baker's assistant noticed first the lantern near the chapel was unlit. Odd, since it had never been missed. By midday, whispers spread across the shops. Had anyone seen him? It wasn't until evening that someone knocked at his small wooden door, then forced it open. Inside, they found him seated in his chair, eyes closed, arms folded like he had only just sat down. A small loaf rested on the table. A candle had burned to its end. No one knew what to do at first. There wasn't family to notify, no clear will, no air dot. But then something curious happened. Shopkeepers, fishmongers, even children who used to run from his stern look, they came quietly, one by one. Someone lit a candle in the chapel. Someone else cleaned his modest room. The boy he had once fed left a ribbon on the door handle. And the next morning, when the city awoke, the bridge was clean, swept, scraped, every lantern polished. No one said who did it. No one needed to. A week later, the council debated how to replace him. Some said a rotating crew could manage. Others said the post wasn't necessary anymore. But when they sent a scribe to inspect the bridge, he returned with a torn cloak and a sprained ankle, having slipped on a patch of ice no one had cleared. After that, a new keeper was named. Young, strong, but with eyes that already seemed a little too tired. He moved into the same quarters, inherited the same logbook, the same responsibilities, but people said he never quite walked the same way, never quite watched the river with the same silence. And on foggy nights, when the tide rolled high and the lanterns swayed in the wind, some swore they still saw a figure at the center of the bridge, just standing, watching, guarding, not as a ghost, not a haunting, just a memory etched into stone, soot, and river mist, the kind that never really fades, only waits, because long after names are forgotten and buildings are torn down and bridges are rebuilt, someone will still have to walk the edge, quietly holding it all together.